for our first ever Shape Talent LinkedIn Live that we are calling Breaking Barriers. This is a new monthly LinkedIn Live. This is our first time. So we're all sitting here thinking, we're definitely live. Yes, there's a red countdown clock. That's a good sign. We're keeping it very informal. We've got Priscilla, who you'll meet in a moment, who's struggling with sneezing. We've got Sharon, who's coughing. But we are very much delighted to be with you, and I'll be introducing you to them properly in a moment. But the title of today's LinkedIn Live is Diagnosing the Barriers to Women's Career Progression in STEM. And we are, as I say, from Shape Talent, which is an award-winning DEI consultancy, working with complex multinational organizations who are serious about gender equality. And we are serious about it, but we're also serious about talking about it, about learning about it, about hearing and sharing ideas about it. And that really is what these LinkedIn Lives are going to be about. My name is Rachel Schofield. I'm one of the senior facilitators here at Shape Talent. And we've set up the LinkedIn Lives to be an informal space to really address important gender equity topics in a way that's accessible through conversation with key players in the industry. So every month I will be interviewing someone involved in supporting gender equity. We're looking to bring insights and ideas on topics of interest to people like you, people who are perhaps supporting gender equity in your organizations. You might be a chief people officer, you might be a head of talent, you might be a chief diversity and inclusion officer, you might just be somebody who is interested in this space. Whichever category you fall into, you are hugely welcome. And today, as I say, we're looking and starting off by diagnosing the barriers to women's career progression in STEM. And I'm joined by two of my colleagues at Shape Talent, as I say, fighting fit. Don't be put off by me saying they're coughing and sneezing. Sharon Peake, who is our founder and CEO. Hello, Sharon.
Hello, good to be here. Thanks for joining, everyone.
And Dr. Priscilla Pereira, who's Director of EDI Research and Product Innovation. Hi, Priscilla.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today.
And just to give you a flavour of how it works before we dive in, we're going to sit and chat for about 20, 25 minutes. We do, though, want to hear from you, and we would love for you to have any questions that you have, put them in the comments. We're going to be keeping our eyes open and making some time at the end to address any questions. But also, this is a conversation. So even if you don't have a question, even if you have a reflection, even if you have something that one of the guests talks about, you think, yeah, that really resonates, that's happening in my organisation, please share it with us, because we would love to hear from you. So without further ado, let us dive into that topic of barriers in women's career progression, particularly in STEM. And Sharon, I'm going to turn to you first, because at Shape Talent, we've conducted research about the barriers that women face in their careers and come to some really powerful conclusions about where those lie. Perhaps you can talk us through that to kick us off.
Yeah, absolutely, Rachel. So we know the world over that women are underrepresented in senior leadership roles. And this holds true across country, across organisation, across industry. So it's a phenomenon we see around the world. So we've looked into what are the reasons for that underrepresentation. And they break down into three types of barriers: societal barriers, which are largely, not exclusively, but largely around gender stereotypes that we see in society, kind of the role that society expects men and women in particular to play. Then there are organisational barriers. These might be cultural, long hours cultures, they might be structural, might be lack of access to sponsors or to networks. And then the third bucket is personal barriers. And these are things that as women we either do or maybe don't do that might inadvertently get in our way. So, we know that women are less likely to engage in organisational politics, for example. We know that women have a greater burden when it comes to managing work-life interfaces, more so than other genders. So we know that there are different types of barriers, and we also know that they vary by industry. So we reached out about a year ago. We did our survey across 9 industries, and we found that the industries that had the highest prevalence of STEM roles, I'm going to call them STEM industries for convenience, had the greatest barriers. So energy, infrastructure, manufacturing all had greater barriers for women than other industries. So we know it's an issue, particularly in some industries. Let me give you just a couple of stats to bring that to life. So for example, in the energy and infrastructure industries, 40% of women, 4 in 10 women, don't feel able to negotiate their own terms. We also know that almost a third of women are afraid to communicate openly for fear of being labelled negatively. And we also know that different women have a different experience. So from our research, we know that women with a disability, women who are bisexual, women who are perimenopausal, Black women, all have a different experience and experience greater barriers in the workplace. So there's a lot in there that comes down to these different barriers that exist in workplaces.
Yeah, and a complexity. And do, if you're listening, if you kind of, if there's particular areas that you are interested in, do let us know that, because we can dig further into some of those areas. But Priscilla, let me turn to you, because those barriers that Sharon outlined are going to be in place in a lot of organizations, but we're looking particularly at STEM, and Sharon already shared some specifics around that. But given that barriers are to some extent across the board, why particularly focus on STEM? Why is it particularly important here?
I guess that there are a couple of things that we need to consider. The first one is about the issue about occupational segregation. So Sharon mentioned in terms of the societal barriers that we do have gender biases, for example, that they start very early, how we educate and socialize our children, for example. So that leads then to girls, for example, not choosing to take topics that's STEM related or not going for STEM careers. So then what you do have is just organizations, but they don't have a pool of talent there. They just don't have enough people. And then the problem becomes even bigger because they don't have enough women in the talent pool. Then they don't have enough data and research because there is a gap there because you don't have enough women, and then you don't have enough leaders that they are women representing the needs of women. And the interesting thing about STEM, and that's helpful way of looking at, is that STEM, they are designing the world. Yeah. And they are designing the world to serve half of the population. And when you don't have enough women there, what you're doing, you're baking in. The discrimination is baked in. So a good analogy is, imagine that when you make a cake, yeah, when the cake is already baked, you cannot just go and pick the disparate ingredients and think that's all good. It's not going to happen like that. You need to start. You need to start again. You need to bake the cake again. So if we don't have enough women in the STEM industry, we will keep designing a world that is not suitable for women. So just to share some data here with you, last year I posted an article from the United Nations, because the United Nations, rightly so, is putting STEM in the STEM industry, or all the industries that within STEM, in the spotlight for the reasons that I just described. So they shared with us, the United Nations, some statistics that they were very interesting that they discussed last year in their last annual review. And the first one was a very interesting one. That's by 2050, 75% of employees, if you like, or jobs will be STEM related. And yet we have 1/3 of women in STEM nowadays. And the situation gets a bit more complicated. From an artificial intelligence point of view, it's just 22% that we have women representing our needs now. And if you think that most of our products, our services, they have already built in some sort of artificial intelligence, you can see how we are designing already products and services that's not suitable for our needs. So if I just give another example, and this is an example that we all use in gender equity, that people they can relate to. So car crashes, for example, we know that women they die more than men in car crashes. And that happened for many years until someone started looking at the data and thinking, just a second, it doesn't make sense. Women, they crash less. And when they crash, they are less likely to be the ones that cause the crash. So how come proportionally they die more? And then, of course, one of the evidences was to find out that the biometrics of the dummies that they used for safety tests, they match the biometrics of men, not women.
Mm.
And then what the companies they are doing now, they're saying, and the problem is when you find a problem like that, takes years then to try to find a solution, because what do? You try different biometrics and they don't work. Do you favor women or do you favor men? So it becomes quite complicated. That will take years and years to solve the problem, and the problem has not been solved yet. So what the companies they're trying to do now is to focus on autonomous driving to prevent accidents. But then once again, if we're looking at the intelligence that we're going to build in this autonomous driving, and we're looking at the behaviors of male drivers and not women, we're
Mm.
going to make cars even safer for men. So can you see the vicious circle? And that's why I guess that the message here is thinking about the cake. STEM, they're designing the world, they are making the cake. If you don't get women to bake this cake as much as men, once the cake is baked, is much harder actually
Mm.
to solve the problem. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I love that cake analogy. Actually, I can see a comment from Mary that's come in. Mary Akangbe saying, so true, we're yet to sort this problem in STEM, and generative AI is creeping in. Also talking about clinical trials for drugs on women's health were done on men. Some really interesting stuff I recall in a book by Caroline Criado Perez on this, Invisible Women. But for a real life example, Sharon, we were talking about car crashes, and you've lived this experience.
I have, and it was only fairly recently when I saw Caroline Criado Perez speak at a conference that I realised I was one of the statistics in her book, Invisible Women. So the example that Priscilla gave about crash test dummies being based on male models was something that I fell foul of. So a number of years ago, I had a pretty nasty car accident. The seatbelt did its job, but the seatbelt is designed on a male crash test dummy, and it's designed to sit below the pelvic bone. But for women, it sits above the pelvic bone. So in this car accident, the lower part of the seatbelt did its job. It cut in to protect me from going through the windscreen. But in doing so, it cut into my abdomen, and it actually caused an internal rupture in my intestines. And that then led to septicemia, which became quite nasty. It was a pretty hairy moment for a little while there. I was very, very desperately unwell. So that was because of the position of the seatbelt. And had I been a man, it wouldn't have impacted me in the same way. So to Priscilla's point about, designing products for everyone, this wasn't a case of inclusive design. I suffered that injury most likely because I was a woman. And so that's why getting more women into STEM roles is so, so desperately important.
Yeah, so when you put it like that, it becomes a much wider societal issue when we see the role in design and things like that. So if we know then that these barriers are particularly pronounced for women in STEM roles or industries with high numbers of STEM roles, what should organizations be thinking about, Sharon? How are they going to address this?
So there's 8 things that we say, so 8 guiding principles that we think organizations should be thinking about. And the first one starts with a really clear diagnosis of what your starting point is. It is really hard to solve anything if you don't know where you are now and have some sense of the underlying root causes of that challenge. And this is tricky, but there is a way of doing it. We have our own survey, for example, that helps to get to the underpinning root causes of the disparity that most organizations have in leadership roles. So first, know where you're starting from. Secondly, you need a really clear tone from the top. So your board, your exco need to be aligned. They need to know why this is important, and they need to know how your gender equity strategy aligns with the business strategy. You've got to have a clear line of sight. Point number 3 is that all too often we see organizations addressing this in a kind of a piecemeal way. And you've really got to think of this as an organizational change process. So building gender inclusive organizations doesn't happen because you've run a program or you've put in place a policy. It is a concerted effort of all of your behaviors, your policies, your practices, your initiatives coming together and being aligned. So you've really got to treat it as a culture change program. That's principle number 3. Number 4 is making sure, kind of following on from that, that your practices and your policies are aligned. No point having a great policy if no one is enacting it and it's not being brought to life. So making sure you're taking out bias from your practices and your processes and they're all aligned. Number 5 is engaging everyone. So if you want to build a bigger pipeline of women through to senior leadership roles, you can't just focus on women. You've got to focus on all genders. We've got to involve men in the discussion. We've got to involve other genders, non-binary people in the discussion as well, because the reality is gender equity impacts everyone and it benefits everyone, but not everyone sees that immediately. So you've got to open the conversation to everyone. Step number 6, which particularly applies in organizations with lots of STEM roles, is that you've got to build the pipeline of talent. So more often in, I'm going to call them for laziness, STEM industries. I know there's no such thing as a STEM industry, but industries with lots of STEM roles, there is a pipeline issue where you're simply not getting that many women coming through the university programs that are kind of feeder qualifications for the roles in organizations. So it's about thinking medium term and long term about how you build that pipeline. Point number 7, we're big fans of positive action programs. So to level the playing field, giving more opportunities for women to have visibility of opportunities. So for example, targeted recruitment programs that may be advertised in places where women are more likely to see the ad and therefore more likely to apply, or women's development programs. We run a lot of these at Shape Talent where we focus on the barriers that are unique to women. So opportunities that give women a chance to level the playing field. And then finally, the 8th principle really is about having a clear and narrow focus. So don't try and boil the ocean, just focus on 2 or 3 things that are going to make the biggest difference, do those well, and then move on to the next 2 or 3 priorities on the list.
Yeah, yeah. Brilliant to have that kind of overview. I'm going to hone in on one of those points in just a moment, but I just want to acknowledge a couple of really helpful comments coming in. Rachel Adeleke, thank you for your comment, reflecting that when she was learning software development, the class was filled with men. I was the only female in a class of 30. I dropped out because I didn't get the support to help me succeed. Really interesting perspective. Thanks for that. Laura, who has joined late, welcome Laura, said, can someone share the statistics? Priscilla was talking about STEM jobs in the UN. In the course of this, you might well hear things you want to hear more about. We would be delighted to share any statistics we have. Laura, do connect with Priscilla here on LinkedIn, and I know she will happily send you that. Lots of stuff on our website as well. I'll say more about that at the end. But yes, if there are things we reference that we graze over, we would be delighted to give you access to those, because there's some really interesting stats out there. And on that point, because Priscilla is our resident data geek, if I'm allowed to call you that, Priscilla, Sharon's first point of those 8 kind of what do we do type things was about knowing the diagnostic, knowing your starting point, having a clear idea of where the issue is. So if data is really important, why do we need to kind of lean into it? What makes it so crucial to understand the data properly?
I guess that data is important for any industry, but I think that if I bring back to STEM, as I mentioned at the beginning, the importance of STEM for the world and designing the world, particularly in the digital economy. Yeah, because we're designing a lot of products and services that is in the digital world now. STEM is in the spotlight. So I guess that most organizations within the STEM discipline topics, they will be held accountable to report their progress. They will probably be they will be expected to have more and more aspirations in terms of their targets and how they are going to solve the societal problem, because it's affecting so many people. So you need to have a very clear data framework that you can inform not just the actions that you are going to move forward with, but also how you're measuring what you are doing is actually giving the results that you need, how you're evaluating if what you're doing is actually it's helping, not kind of maybe taking you back. So it's very important for you to take an evidence-based approach to be more impactful in terms of your progress.
Yeah. So if people are thinking, right, okay, I've understood that, but where do I need to kind of focus my efforts? Because not all data is going to be equally valuable. So I guess if people in HR, EDI, leaders there are thinking, well, what data should I collect? Where should they start, Priscilla?
Yes, and that's a very good point, actually, because what you do have nowadays is an overwhelm of data, right? And sometimes even people reusing data. And that's something that you need to be careful with. But if I just made a list very quickly of things that I consider when I'm helping organizations in terms of revising their EDI dashboards, for example, and their data frameworks from a gender equity point of view. So the first one is most organizations that will measure gender disparity. Yeah, so when disparity already happened, so your gender pay gap, your gender board composition, how many women they have been promoted, and that's fine. And you need that to know where you are, but that's a bit too late. To
Mm.
inform action, you need to take one step back and see what is driving this disparity the most. And a way of looking at that, think about the employment cycle and where exclusion happens the most. And probably between us, we're going to be able to make a list of where exclusion is happening the most. Is not new for anyone, but the powerful information from our data here is from everything. What are your 2 or 3 main drivers to in terms of driving disparity? Is that because women, they're not being visible enough, because there is perhaps in meetings that is a high activity that happens in organizations? For example, we have issues around gender say gap. Or is that because men, they are working more than women? So if you think about it, it's hard to compete, right? If I work 40 hours and I'm competing with my peer that's working 50 hours, and also I have less headspace because I have a lot of chores at home, it's going to be very hard to compete. So organizations often, they say, but Priscilla, I can't really change how people, they are organizing their family homes. No, you can't, but you can measure how many hours men, they are working compared to women, and you can campaign to make sure that you level that, because otherwise the competition is always going to be unfair. So I guess that the first point is take one step before, measure the barriers, measure what barriers they are driving the outcomes in terms of intention to leave or disparity the most, and then focus on them. Focus on 2 or 3 barriers that will give you the best results. So that's one point. Another point is to be mindful of EDI metrics that you use as well, data from majority and from dominant groups. So,
Mm.
for example, inclusion indexes. How many times I have been working with executives and they see their inclusion indexes and say, oh, that's great, look at that, everybody feels included. But then when you look at 90% of people, they have the same characteristics, or they all from that dominant group. It's easy to feel included when we're all the same, right?
Yeah.
So, one of the key things for EDI and data is what we should be kind of having focus on is the experience of minoritized groups, and in some cases the minoritized groups, so I say what I mean by minoritized, they're groups that they experience prejudice. Yeah, so sometimes you might have an organization that you have a lot of women, but they are still subject to prejudice, so they kind of minoritize. So you're really interested in looking at minoritized, but with STEM, they are minoritized and they're also the minority because
Mm.
they're not enough. So it's very easy for stakeholders to dismiss that population because it doesn't represent the whole.
Mm.
So when I see EDI reports, for example, that you have indexes, inclusion indexes with the overall, this is less helpful. If you're going to use that in your report, compare at least how your dominant groups and your majority groups, they are experiencing inclusion compared to minoritized and minority groups. And it's the same thing when companies, for example, they measure culture of dignity and respect. And sometimes they look and say, look, 98% of my workforce never experienced bullying, harassment, and discrimination. And to say, okay, but that's not the point. We have even laws to protect certain groups because we know that they are subject to more discrimination. So let's look at the 2% because that's the data that we need to be looking at, not the 98%. So that's something that you need to be looking at because the stakeholders, they will get distracted with the overall data, and that's not what EDI is about. There is another thing as well to be mindful, and is about reusing data. So I have seen before in EDI dashboards engagement surveys, for example, and that can be quite problematic because what you do have in terms of engagement surveys and how you construct the questions and the statements, they will be measuring things like, for example, energy, mental energy, motivation, determination. Those things, they have nothing to do with inclusion, right? Inclusion. Have I been heard? Have I been valued? Does that make sense? Do I feel safe? So those are the things that they're going to measure inclusion. And then what we do know is that minoritized groups, they tend to be more motivated. They tend to be more engaged anyway, because they try to compensate for all the barriers that they experience. Because of course they start in the race behind. So of course they need to have all this extra resilience, career resilience, even to stay in the game, even if they know they're never going to win. Right? So it's very complicated for us to reuse data without taking into consideration what we are measuring, and actually that is really useful for DNI. Another point is about self-declaration, and I think the Freud STEM is something that you need to watch out as well, because you have got the numbers of women, for example, in that population is going to be small. You might have issues of particularly if people, they don't feel safe. You might have issues about people not self-declaring in terms of their demographic. And then what you do have, you end up with a beautiful data set, but a lot of prefer not to say, people not saying what departments they are working, or even not declaring their demographics because they are afraid of being identified. So it's very important to campaign how you're handling this data, and making sure that people, they feel safe to actually to declare where they are coming from. And even if you have got a lot of prefer not to say, or people not saying what departments that they are from, this is information. Also, because that's telling, one of the hypotheses here potentially is people, they're not feeling safe. And you will see that sometimes when people, they don't say, because good practice always give options for people to say prefer not to say, because it's voluntary. So sometimes people, they are not going to, when they select prefer not to say for the department, they tend to be very, very explicit in terms of how they feel, because they know they cannot know where department I am from, for example. So, or even this type of data is quite important for you to reflect as well. And lastly is about intersectional data. And Sharon made this point very beautifully, because we're all going to be, at some point, we're going to be part of the minorities, but some parts in our life, we're going to be part of the majority as well. So, and we know that if you have got more identities that they are subject to prejudice, for example, that you are going to experience the barriers more harshly. So intersectional data is very, very important in the whole EDI context, if you like, and when you are measuring gender as well. So gender, and what else? What are the other intersections that you have got there, and how women, they are experiencing that?
Priscilla, thank you. I love the data, is so interesting. I know you've got loads of other things. If you want more from Priscilla about data, she's got so many interesting pointers. So we've got some great kind of yardsticks there of things that you should be measuring, looking out for. Sharon, bring this to life a little bit for us, because at Shape, obviously, we work with organisations. We see the value of using data. Perhaps you can draw on one of our experiences about how that looks in practice.
Yeah, sure. And perhaps a good example is to share how we use our 3 barriers diagnostic survey that I mentioned earlier. Not a good time for my voice to cut out. Hopefully it will stay with me. Excuse me. So we have a survey that takes the 3 barriers model that I described earlier, and we apply it to all employees in an organization. So, and employees of all genders, by the way. So under those 3 barriers, there are actually 21 underpinning sub-barriers. And so we worked with a client fairly recently where we surveyed their employees, all genders, to find out what was going on, because what's really important here is you want to get to the root causes of why are these issues arising. You know what the issues are, you can see that, but why are they arising? And what we were able to identify is the groups of women that are most at risk of leaving, and the reasons why they were most at risk at leaving. So in this particular organization, it will be different for every company, of course. 26% of women were a flight risk compared to 16% of men. So there was a huge statistically significant difference between the leaving intention of women and men. And we were able to identify, and again, these factors were specific and unique to that organization. They'll be different for every other organization, but we were able to see that in this business, women had a real perception that they were being underpaid. Rightly or wrongly, there was a strong perception of that was feeding into this leaving intention. There was a real sense that the immediate line manager was not supportive enough or clear enough in what the woman needed to do to progress her career. There were, in pockets, a real lack of psychological safety, so a real sense of I can't speak up, I can't say what's on my mind. And we were also able to identify that there were some groups of women in some places of the organisation that were particularly experiencing these barriers. So quite surprisingly, at a mid-level, the barriers were being experienced most acutely. We thought it might happen at a slightly more senior level in the career path, but it was happening for mid-level women. We could also see by location where this was most pronounced. So the organisation was able to get a really clear map of where are the parts of the business, what grade, what level, what role, what locations are these issues happening, and what are the things we need to fix? We need to look at, are there real pay discrepancy? Is that true or false? Is it, if it's just a perception, there's a communications exercise to be done. If there's truth in it, then we need to fix it. They were able to look at how they might make sure managers were more supportive in career discussions, and they had some infrastructure around that. But most importantly, they were also able to identify pockets of really good practice. There was some great practice going on in certain business units and countries that maybe had gone unnoticed, where women were not a flight risk, where these barriers weren't applying so acutely. And so there's a great opportunity to share some of that best practice within the organisation, which is always lovely when you can find that. So I think there's something really important here about being able to identify the root causes of what's going on with kind of some real pinpoint accuracy, so you know where to invest your very limited EDI budgets to make the biggest impact.
Yeah. And what's so interesting there is that it can be non-obvious. It can, without the real data, you can jump to what you think is happening, and actually you haven't really pinpointed the root of the problem. How interesting. We're coming to the end of our time together. We've got a few more minutes. I know some people maybe have to jump off, but I can see there's one question I'm going to turn to in the comments in a moment. If you have a question that you would like to ask, now is the moment to put that in the comments. Just in case some people have to dash off, I'm just going to take a moment here. I'll reiterate this at the end, just to say we would love to see you again in a month's time, because our next LinkedIn Live is happening on the 29th of February at 3 o'clock. It's with Robert Baker, who's trustee of UN Women UK. He's vice chair of European Women on Boards. The topic that time is going to be the role of men in enabling gender equity. As I say, we want to kind of look at this from all angles, and Robert is great on this. So we'll be talking about that on the 29th of February. So if you have to whiz off, do get that in your diary. Look out for more posts on LinkedIn. And equally, if you're dashing, then please do connect with Sharon, with Priscilla on LinkedIn. We would be more than happy to follow up with you with any questions. You can follow Shape Talent. We have a monthly newsletter. So if you want to explore that in any way for your organisation, anything that you've heard, we would love to hear from you. But I'm not going to go right now, because there are at least one question had come in, and this was a question I know from Jen Burns, who hopefully is still on the call, who makes a really interesting question. Sharon, I'm going to put this to you. This is about when you kind of have competing pressures within your organization. So Jen asks a question that I think is probably quite common. What happens when your gender equity or your I&E strategy doesn't align to your current business strategy? And of course, if you're in the thick of that, you're hitting up against perhaps a lack of goodwill, a lack of people saying, what's the business case? Good question, isn't it?
It's a great question. I'm going to be really blunt and say, if you don't have alignment, you're not going to get the progress you need. So the reality is you've got to have your board, your executive committee on board, and you've got to have an understanding of why this is important to the business. Now, I'll give you an example from my own personal experience, and it can be easier in consumer industries than in B2B industries. I worked in a consumer business, which was a beverages business. Most of the product that we made was beer, so it is targeted predominantly at a male consumer. Part of the business strategy was to get more women consumers, to sell to more women, to create products that appeal to more women. And when we looked at our sales force, our marketing teams, most of the people in the organization were men. 81% of our employees globally were men. So it was very male dominated. So how do you, back to Priscilla's point, how do you create products that meet the needs of women if the people involved all the way through that product development are mostly men? So there was a very clear case for us in enabling, better gender balance, because it was really important to the products that we're developing. But that aside, if you're not in a consumer industry and that isn't so relevant, there are a number of drivers typically that we see in organizations that make this important strategically to focus on. So one is the competition for talent. So if you're in a business that has growth plans, and who doesn't, you need talent to be able to grow. How do you attract the best talent if your practices and processes are ignoring large swathes of the population? So the competition for talent is usually relevant to most businesses. If you're in an industry that is regulated, like financial services, you will have pressures around reporting and compliance. There's a lot at the moment going on with the FCA consultation and diversity and inclusion. So there'll be regulatory pressures. There might be naming and shaming pressures of, being reported in terms of your progress against these things. You might have reputational risks that are strategically important. So if you're not seen to be keeping up with your industry, well, that poses a risk. You might have activist investors that speak up in board meetings and ask questions about this. You might have new board members that are putting pressure on the executive committee to do something about this. And we have seen in organizations that had their investor rating downgraded because of a lack of EDI progress or commitment. So there are all sorts of strategic pressures that make this important, and it's just working out what are those levers in your organization and making sure there is real alignment around those.
Yeah. Thanks, Jen. I hope that was helpful. I mean, what I heard you say there, Sharon, is really kind of the answer to the question that we sometimes get, like, well, why should I care? Why should this be an issue? And the fact that actually that there is a really strong business case for it. And it's about sort of identifying, well, how does this make sense? How do I make this important to the people who are skeptical or who don't kind of see it that way? But actually, when you frame it as you have with some of those really key pressure points, that's really helpful. So Jen, I hope that kind of gives you something to think about and take away to your organization, if that was why you were asking. I could ask so many more questions, but we've come to the end of our session today, and I've done a double check that there aren't any questions that we've missed. But if you have something you wanted to ask, maybe you'd rather take it offline, then you are very welcome to reach out, as I say, to Priscilla, to Sharon here on LinkedIn. Do follow them, connect, ask your questions, send them a message. We're Shape Talent. We have our own business page, of course, on LinkedIn as well. We have a monthly newsletter, which is full of really interesting research that we're doing, information that we're coming across that we want to share. And we very much look forward to seeing you on the 29th of February for our next LinkedIn Live with Robert Baker on the role of men in enabling gender equity. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to Sharon. Thank you to Priscilla. And we look forward to making this our regular monthly live and sharing lots of what we know and what we care about in the world of gender equity. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks everyone.
See you next month.
Bye.
Cheerio.